So we're doing a Q&A today. You've seen them before probably. I'm not recreating the wheel here, but to commemorate 1,500 subscribers, we're going to take a look at some of the most interesting and best social science questions I've received since I founded the channel. So, Sandra asks, are there any women's perspectives in sociocultural anthropology? Are women represented in the literature? Which is a great question. The short answer is yes, absolutely yes. There are many very important female voices in the field. In my doctoral work, for example, I drew a lot from Tanya Lehrman, who's utterly brilliant, from Susan Reynolds White and Barbara Gierke, all of whom work on magic and medicine in some capacity. And if you're into environmental anthropology, I swear it's mathematically impossible to avoid reading Helen Kopina and Eleanor Shorman Wee May, who basically for every year for the last 2 decades have been publishing these gigantic overviews of the field that just dominate non-specialist discourse. So really today, in whatever subdiscipline you look at, you'll find a significant number of highly competent female voices as authors and as classroom educators, which is something I'm very proud of as an anthropologist, but institutionally speaking, with regard to the ability of women to climb to high-level institutional positions, there's still a lot that we can do to promote more systemic gender equality. And historically, it was much, much harder for women in the various branches of anthropology. For the majority of the history of the discipline, so the late 19th and 20th century, and I'm talking mostly about Western Europe and North America, right? Research and lecturing was dominated by men, as was the majority of university education at the time. But there were still some totally incredible female pioneers, particularly in North America, who did a lot to shape the development and the direction of the discipline. Margaret Mead would be one of the big ones, the first one that comes to mind. And her work on kinship and attitudes regarding sexuality in the South Pacific was extremely influential in the 1960s and 70s. And another one, Ruth Benedict, who was a total badass, was one of her professors at Barnard College in the 1920s. And I'm not going to do like a huge list of famous women in the field, but yes, absolutely yes, some of the most influential voices in the field today are women. And also critical feminist theory is still an important theoretical lens that we apply in our work from time to time. Valentina asks, could I recommend a commentary on the history of sociocultural anthropology that outlines the intellectual history of the field from Adolf Bastian to the present day? So yeah, Adolf Bastian, if you don't know, was a 19th century German author and kind of proto-ethnographer who, in a deeply flawed but very thought-provoking series of books called Man in History, did some of the first work theorizing what we now call enculturation, looking at the way that different patterns of belief and behavior play a decisive role in shaping our cultural identities. So the way that our sense of self, our value systems, and our perception of the world are derived from cultural experience. And this is some of the first evidence-based, at least, let's say, empirically oriented argumentation for the nature side of the nature versus nurture debate. And his ideas were particularly influential on Franz Boas, who was born in Germany, but went on to become one of the most prominent early ethnographers in the history of American anthropology. So we're looking for something that gives a broad overview of the development of anthropology in North America with an eye towards the cross-fertilization of ideas between Europe and the United States in the early 20th century. So one book that I've used in the classroom and can recommend is Alan Barnard's History and Theory in Anthropology. It's pretty short, very concise, and really focuses on the theoretical debates that have dominated the discipline at various points in time, exploring the deep intellectual historical roots of different viewpoints in anthropology's development. Thomas Erickson and Finn Nielsen also wrote a very good overview called History of Anthropology, which I can recommend, but it doesn't have a particular geographical bias. It just takes the discipline as a whole, exploring its development across different national contexts. But those are both very good places to start. In fact, if you just look Thomas Erickson up online, he's written a bunch of introductory texts to the field. Some are more simplistic and aimed at high school students, but others are very sophisticated in their historical approach. So if you check them out and have a look at the books that I mentioned, those are all very good places to start, I think. You couldn't really go wrong. So thank you very much for the question. So this is a question about the differences between ethnographic films, documentaries, and mockumentaries. I think how visual anthropologists understand the three and where they would situate stuff like mockumentaries, things like This Is Spinal Tap or The Gods Must Be Crazy, both from the 1980s, or even like more recent films like Borat.
Over here, art down a kindergarten. And here, Oliver Mukhtar Sakharov,
which use the visual conventions of documentary in telling a fictional story. In visual anthropology, there's a whole body of literature on this. But to simplify things dramatically, ethnographic films, at their core, are documentary films in which filmmakers attempt to document cultural phenomena as objectively as possible for the purposes of social scientific research and education. And that's obviously not the goal of all documentary filmmaking. A lot of documentaries are highly subjective and polemical. They often try to convince and persuade rather than inform and document. And in that sense, all ethnographic films are documentaries, right? But not all documentaries are ethnographic. Now, with regard to mockumentaries specifically, and whether or not we can consider them a part of documentary filmmaking, there are basically two opposing answers in the literature. Again, this is simplifying things considerably, but on the one hand, you have theorists like Di Vaughan, for example, who, I don't want to mischaracterize him, but who tend to emphasize the visual and stylistic conventions of documentary as the genre's defining characteristics, as well as its mode of perception. In other words, you know, if it looks and feels like a documentary and the audience thinks that it's a documentary, then we might as well consider it a documentary, even if it's telling a fictional story. So in this line of thinking, stylistic conventions and the audience's perception of the content are the decisive factors in articulating what is and is not a genre film. And I like that. As a definition, it's flexible and non-dogmatic, and it invites people to be critical and discuss a film rather than just like classifying it in some kind of rigid taxonomy, right? On the other hand, you have other, I think, more mainstream disciplinary theorists like Bill Nichols. And across his work, he argues that a film's attempt to depict the lived reality of its subjects is an essential part of what makes it a documentary or an ethnographic film. And in that case, we would argue that mockumentary adopts the stylistic conventions of documentary, but is actually a subgeneric movement within fiction, rather than being like a form of documentary filmmaking. Now, I empathize more with that second perspective, but I do think that Di Vaughan's take here is important, and in no way is less valuable as an effort to define documentary filmmaking than Bill Nichols. So thank you, Alberto, for the question. So, is Avatar an ethnographic film? Short answer, no. No, it's not. And I know that I took the piss, yeah, with the thumbnail here, but I think I know where this question is coming from, and contextually, it probably makes more sense than you think. James Cameron's Avatar, say whatever you will about it, is a film that immerses its audience in a setting. You spend a lot of time learning about the Na'vi, their society, and the ecosystems of Pandora. And in that sense, What the film kind of looks like is anthropological science fiction, which is more of a movement in literature than film. But I think that that's kind of where the question comes from. And one of the best examples of anthro sci-fi would be Ursula K. Le Guin, whose mother and father were both anthropologists. And she drew from that working knowledge of anthropological theory in detailing her story worlds. And anthro sci-fi, taking one of her books, The Left Hand of Darkness, as an example, usually features a single protagonist from like an advanced spacefaring culture that travels to a less technologically advanced world with dramatically different beliefs and social systems. And that character then serves as an audience surrogate as they learn languages and gradually adapt to the alien culture, which sounds a lot like Avatar. I mean, the male protagonist even works together with an anthropologist, a Sigourney Weaver's character, to better integrate into the native, the indigenous population. So why not say that Avatar is a work of anthropological science fiction? And I don't want to gatekeep here, but anthro sci-fi, at least, good anthro sci-fi, uses actual social scientific theory to explore the limits of different social systems, different forms of government, or to explore and problematize existing social institutions. The Left Hand of Darkness, for example, looks at how kinship systems and social institutions would evolve differently in a world without biological sex, or more specifically, in a world in which people are born androgynous and then become biologically male or female for brief periods, for like 2 days every month, and then go back to being androgynous after they reproduce. So over the course of a person's life, in this story world, they might end up being both male and female at different points in their lives. And the book really focuses on how gender and sex would be constructed differently in that kind of a world, as well as how kinship and social systems would function differently. And in that sense, it's very clearly a reflection on, or really a deconstruction of, how gender roles are perceived in Western cultures. For that reason, it's also considered to be one of the first works of feminist science fiction. So in The Left Hand of Darkness, the setting isn't like an immersive backdrop for badass science fiction action. The setting itself actually is the science fiction. In some ways, it's more important than the narrative. And that's what Avatar doesn't do. I don't mean, discuss gender. And obviously this is my opinion here, but Avatar does not detail its story world as an ethnographically informed exploration of alternate social systems, or as, a well-informed critique of existing social institutions. Okay, in a very two-dimensional sense, it's a criticism of, capitalism and the military industrial complex, in the sense of like technology and imperialism, bad, nature and empathy, good, right? And hey, if you enjoy the film, that's great. This isn't about whether or not it's an enjoyable film or a well-made film, but while I think that it's been inspired by literary works of anthropological science fiction, I don't think that we can justifiably call it a piece of anthro sci-fi. Come to think of it, there's also ethnographic fiction, which is a whole other thing, really. I have a video on that, actually, and Avatar isn't ethnographic fiction either. No, it's not an ethnographic or, I think, even an anthropological film. But the question does make sense, and I totally get where you're coming from. So thank you very much for writing. It was actually a very thought-provoking and very fun question. It's very cool. Thanks. So, Chronicles of Ashley asks an interesting question. If I can do a video on the most commonly used anthropological theory today. And I didn't do this. I didn't do it for one very specific reason. If you look at the history of anthropology, or really like any field in the humanities, you'll see that through most of the 19th and 20th centuries, various academic disciplines are, from time to time, dominated by a single theoretical approach, which is obviously very limiting. For example, in social and cultural anthropology, for about 2 decades, up through the 1950s, there was kind of like a zeitgeist in which structural functionalism was the dominant perspective in the field. Ethnographers were constantly looking for the function that rituals, beliefs, and institutions played in maintaining and consolidating social order. And that's a fairly myopic perspective that fell out of vogue in the 1960s. The thing is, today, anthropology is a much more complex and heterogeneous field than it was back in the 1960s. And the area covered by anthropological inquiry is so vast that there's really no one theory or ideological movement that sufficiently dominates the discourse to the point where I would call it, the most common theory. I thought about saying stuff like decoloniality, intersectionality, various applications of critical theory, or some facet of the linguistic turn from the 1980s, but honestly, all of those things will be more or less applicable depending on your subdiscipline and geographical area of research. But what might be interesting would be to do a top 10 video covering like the most important theoretical movements in the history of anthropology. That way I could talk around the question, right, without actually answering the question, which, if I'm being honest, is like my only marketable skill as an academic. So thank you, Chronicles, for the question. I may actually make a video based on that. So very cool. Thanks. Now, Liliana asks, if you're using interviews in your research, right, at what stage of the project should you decide on a sampling method? And is that something that you have to explain when you write a research proposal? And that's a very important question about methodology. Now, what the OP is referring to are methods for selecting who to interview and how many people to interview. Methods like purposeful, random, or snowball sampling. And that's obviously a very important part of, designing a research project. You have to have some kind of methodological blueprint before you begin. Now, my answer here is that it depends on whether you're writing a funding proposal or submitting a research proposal to an ethics committee for approval before you begin your field work. And if you're a student, brace yourself, because you're going to be doing both of those things a lot if you end up going into research. But in both of those cases, you should definitely choose a sampling method for your interviews as part of your research proposal. And be able to articulate why you think that your chosen method is appropriate for your research environment. That's something that you'll usually be expected to know. Now, something to keep in mind, though, is that it's okay to change your research methods and sampling techniques once you're in the field. Research environments usually are fluid, and sometimes you have to be adaptable. It's not, ideal, but if you do that, it's something you should explain in your written work, in your thesis or, article or book or, whatever it is that you're doing, because those kinds of methodological changes can impact the quality and the type of data that you collect. But if you're not writing for an ethics committee or doing a funding proposal, you have much more leeway regarding when you need to settle on your sampling methods. I would argue that in some cases, you can wait until you've made preliminary contact with your participants, but only if you already have an understanding of the different methods that you might use, as well as their, respective strengths and weaknesses. So that was really fun. I actually really enjoyed doing this. It felt a lot like teaching, which is something I've always loved, and I'll probably do another episode like this around, say, 5,000 subscribers. Speaking of which, like, subscribe, smash that bell, do all the YouTube stuff, but also send me your social science questions. Send me your weird and topical questions about sociology and anthropology. I will try to get around to answering most of them in time. It's super fun to do. So for now, I guess that's it. If you're still watching, thank you very much for sticking around. And until next time, never stop learning. A huge thanks to this lovely person and to my other Tier 1 supporters on Patreon. You're all totally awesome. Thank you so much. And if you would like to support independent social scientific education, you can come check us out on Patreon for various ways to support the channel.